Hello and welcome back to Rock Records Reviewed. My name's Adam, and this week we're going to take a look at Brit Pop legends Blur. Blur formed in 1988 at Goldsmiths College in New Cross, not far from here, when Damon Albarn, a singer and songwriter, and Graham Coxon, a guitar player, both from Essex in the southeast of England, got together with Alex James, a bass player, and Dave Rowntree, a drummer. They formed a band called Seymour, and they toured the venues around London, and they were eventually spotted by the Food label, who signed them in 1990 and persuaded them to change their name to Blur. With Oasis, they kind of formed the real spearhead of the Britpop movement in the 1990s in Britain, and I think for a while became the sort of new Beatles and the Stones of the scene. The whole thing culminating in the Battle of Britpop, when the two bands in 1995 were aiming for the number one slot, Blur with Country House and Oasis with Roll With It. And the whole thing was constantly on the news and in the papers, and it was all very exciting for a while. I think Blur were kind of the thinking man's Britpop band. You know, they were more art pop, and they were influenced by more sort of perhaps erudite things than Oasis were, who were more blokey and confrontational, and certainly a lot more hirsute. And yes, I know I've got ridiculous lockdown hair, and I'm trusting you have as well. This was an easy list to do because I lived it. Blur were contemporaries of my band in the 1990s, and rumour has it that when they were Seymour, we shared many of the same bills, and I do vaguely remember their name being on some of the bills that we played. But of course, once they broke through, our bands went in very, very different directions. But, you know, Blur were an inspiration, absolutely, if not an influence, and I was definitely a fan. And I went to many brilliant, very sweaty shows in those early days, and I bought every album the day it came out. Graham Coxon did come to one of my shows once, the Monarch in Camden. I don't think he stayed for the whole thing, which isn't a bad thing, because I vaguely remember it being very, very hot and packed, and I ended that show with my shirt off, which is not something I'd wish upon anybody. Anyway, look, on that unsavoury note, why don't you pull yourself a pint, put on your parka, and let's have it large as we go back to the brilliant 1990s and look at the 8 albums made by Blur. So at number 8, I'm going to put from 1991 their debut album, Leisure. Blur were emerging from the scene in the 1990s on the coattails of the Stone Roses and the Happy Mondays and the Manchester movement. And with Oasis and Suede, clearly something was beginning to happen, not just in music but in culture as well. But with this album, I think the public felt that they might be riding on the coattails of the Manchester scene too much. Certainly the single There's No Other Way has that beat and vibe about it. But it got to number 8 in the charts, that song, their first top 10 hit. The other great songs on here are sort of She's So High and Sing, which are good. And the singles are good, but the whole album itself does seem to have a lack of depth compared to what came later. Band is clearly sort of still finding its feet, and the sound is thin, and I think that it's so thin, actually, that their whole album got sort of remastered on its 21st anniversary edition. And the reception for this album was lukewarm, and Damon Albarn himself thinks this is one of only 2 bad records he's ever made. There's also a number of producers on here, all sort of trying to give a very patchy album some character and identity. But still, there was a lot of a hype over the record, and the movement itself just propelled the record to number 7 in the charts. But much, much greater things were to come. At number 7, from 2003, their 7th album, Think Tank. Now, by this point, Damon Albarn had formed Gorillaz, a side band, and you can really hear their influence on this. He was really expanding his songwriting. Some of this album was recorded in Morocco, and you can hear hip-hop and jazz and dub, and the use of loops and samples and things. And there is sort of freestyle looseness to the whole album, which isn't unsurprising, because much of it was written in extended jams where they were improvising writing sessions. It's produced by Ben Hillier, along with some help from William Albert, who'd already worked with the band by this point, and Fatboy Slim himself, Norman Cook. Alban claims it's a loose concept album about love and politics, and he'd previously spoken out about the invasion of Afghanistan and things like that. But really, there's not much love in the studio at this point, because I think the side project, Gorillaz, it didn't sit well, particularly with Graham Coxon, who barely contributed to these very tense sessions, and in fact left the band not long while this album was being made. It's definitely not a fun record, and I think the best song is the lead single, "Out of Time," which is absolutely lovely. It was their fifth consecutive number one album, and at this time their highest US chart placing at number 56, which gives you a good idea of their stock in the States. The album cover is, of course, by Banksy. But the whole thing sort of feels a bit like another Damon Albarn side project to me, rather than a Blur album. At number 6 from 2015, their eighth and most recent album, Magic Whip, or Magic Whip if you watch and enjoy Family Guy like I do. The band had been on a 12-year hiatus, and they'd all gone off and done different things. Damon Albarn was conquering the music world with all sorts of different projects. Graham Coxon was making indie guitar albums. Dave Rowntree had got into politics, and Alex James had bought himself a farm and started making cheese. But the band reformed to great fanfare to do some shows in Hyde Park, and they were brilliant. I was there. And then they went to Japan to do more shows, but these shows got cancelled for some reason, and the band found themselves stranded in Hong Kong with nothing to do. So they thought, well, let's just go into the studio and bash out some ideas, and that's what they did. They ended up with all these sketches of songs and things like that, and they ended up sitting around the songs for over a year before Graham Coxon finally roped in their old collaborator Stephen Street to sort of help construct an album and whip everything into shape. And really, you know, what could have and perhaps should have been a very patchy, random album pleasing no one actually holds together really well. I mean, it's not a total triumph, I think, but the best moments, like New World Towers and Lonesome Street, are great, and they have that really lovely sort of melancholy pop flavour that Blur do so well. Go Out was the first of 5 singles that came out. But I think by now the singles chart really was the home of rap and dance, and perhaps not older music like this was seen at the time. And chart placings, really, as they remain to this day, are largely irrelevant, I think, to many record buyers. The album itself got to number 1. It went gold, and Blur were back, only for the 4 of them to quickly disband and all go their separate ways again. At number 5 from 1995, their 4th album, The Great Escape. Now, this album was the album that came out when Britpop was at its absolute zenith, and it was from this album came Country House, the song that beat Oasis's roll with it to number 1, and thus Blur won that battle. But this album, I think, following on for Parklife, was criticised for being bloated and forced after Parklife's huge success. And the band were at their commercial peak, and it went straight into number 1 and top 10 all over Europe. And it's full of really good tunes. I mean, you've got Country House and Stereotype and Charmless Man and The Universal, which is lovely. And there's a lot of fun and confidence on what is a bright, colourful album full of hooks. And I suppose even if the taste itself doesn't linger as long as it does on their best work, the album was lauded on release, but I think over time its popularity has diminished a little bit. Still got to 725 on the 1,000 top albums of all time. And I think it's a real important album for anybody wanting to sort of look into Britpop and investigate what that was all about. You'd have to put this album into one of the go-to Britpop records, despite the fact, as I said, that over time I think his reputation has diminished a bit. At number 4, their 6th album from 1999, 13. Blur brought in William Orbit, who'd worked with Madonna and all sorts of people, to produce a new sound, because they wanted to move away from Britpop and indie by this point. And also, I think they got a bit comfortable working with Stephen Street. And sure enough, this does feel like a new direction. It's much, much looser than the previous records, but it's not retro. You've got songs like Tender, No Distance Left to Run, Coffee and TV, all singles and all great songs. And they are among their best tunes on you know, a lot of this album is quite dark because it deals with Damon Albarn's split with Justin Fleischman, the lead singer of Elastica, who he'd been going out with for a long time. And I think that band tensions were strained during recordings. Albarn wanted to be experimental, whereas Coxon wanted to be punky and indie. But there are moments where it's quite uplifting as well, and I think as a result this is sort of quite a complex, interesting album that does bear repeated listening. Perhaps the opposite of The Great Escape. As always, there are melodies all over the place, and the album went platinum and it was nominated for a Mercury Music Prize. 3 singles went top 20, and the album itself charted top 20 all over Europe. So the new direction was paying off, both critically and commercially in some respects, if perhaps not quite at the peak that they had been. At number 3, I'm going to put their 5th album from 1997, Blur. Bizarrely, and by 1997, the public perception of Blur was at an all-time low. The appeal of The Great Escape had waned quite quickly, and people were already becoming a little bit cynical about Brit Pop, with all the Brit Pop musicians going to number 10 Downing Street, meeting Tony Blair and all that sort of thing. And I think although they had won the battle of Britpop with the singles, they really did lose the war with Oasis, certainly in terms of worldwide record sales. And I think by this point they were seen by a lot of people as sort of insincere middle-class fart pop. And they needed a new direction, but then they'd completely failed to set the USA alight with their music. But it was to the USA, I think, they turned for the inspiration for this album. They looked at a lot of American indie music culture and grunge culture. They looked at Nirvana and Sonic Youth and Pavement and bands like that. This has a lot to do with Graham Coxon, I think, particularly. And all of that led to their biggest worldwide hit, Song 2, from this album. And America was finally cracked, if certainly not conquered. The album opens with the downbeat Beatle bum, which was a very brave thing to do, but the song still got to number 1, and things went global then with Song 2 itself, completely contradicting the record label's claim that the album didn't have any singles on it. But, what do record companies know, that's for sure. The whole sound is stripped back. It's much, much harder, more indie than before, and it does, like I said, it kind of feels a bit like a Graham Coxon album to me, this one, especially with songs like You're So Great on it, which I absolutely love. Again, went platinum, number 1, charted all across Europe, and certainly became Blur's biggest album in the States at this time. 137 in NME's greatest albums of all time, and also included in the 1,000 albums you must hear before you die. But I think more lasting than all of those sort of accolades is Song 2 and its licensing power, because you hear it in, all sorts of videos and commercials and games and films and TV. You can just see some skateboarder, doing loops or whatever they're called. I don't have any skating vocabulary at all, clearly. To Song 2. But this is an album the band are rightly very fond of, I think. At number 3, from 1993, their second album. Number 3. Sorry, at number 2. So many numbers. At number 2, their second album from 1993, Modern Life is Rubbish. I love this album. It's a huge leap from their debut, arguably the album that set the template and the tempo for Britpop itself, but it was touch and go. The first album had been very poorly received in some quarters, and they'd done a very poorly received tour of the USA prior to this album. America was still in the throes of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and grunge and everything. And that combined with the backlash of their debut and bands like Suede coming through, who just seemed more in tune with the record buying public at this moment, something had to change, and it did. I think Damon Albarn decided he needed a real 180-degree turn in his songwriting, and he started drawing upon the 60s and people like Ray Davies and Small Faces and Bowie and Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd, and using that influence, he started writing about songs that extol the beauty and banality of English culture, from its music to its quirky personalities and its train-spotting characters. You can really particularly hear the Kinks' influence coming through on this album as well, and he's really writing about more interesting elements of life. It really is a huge opening up of his songwriting horizons. For Tomorrow, Blue Jeans, Advert, Chemical World, these great Britpop songs. The sound is lusher, the playing is better. They're really starting to develop a way with a tune, to the point where they even used to write the chords of their songs on the inner sleeves of their albums, which I always thought was a lovely thing to do. Especially Graham Coxon, as well. He's really starting to come through here and sound like a very fine, creative and distinctive guitarist. The album got to number 15 and was a critical success, and it was just enough, I think, for Food to think they were onto something, and how right they were, because my number one Blur album is their third album from 1994. Of course, it's Parklife itself. And this is where I really came on board. I remember very vividly hearing Girls and Boys for the first time. I was watching an episode of Friends in bed one Saturday morning as a layabout student. Friends, there you go. It dates everything, doesn't it? And it came on, and I thought, what is that? That sounds like some Bowie offcut from Lodger. It was retro, it was fresh, it was cool, it was catchy, and I wanted in. And so I immediately I was kind of signed up on the Blur train, as it were. This album, I think, along with Oasis, has definitely maybe changed everything. Not just for Blur, but for a whole generation of young Brits. And suddenly music was at the epicenter of culture again. Kids were picking up guitars, wanting to be in bands. And I think Britpop was undoubtedly, for us, the last great guitar movement. The album, was just more of the same with regards Boys and Girls, in that you could hear the Who and Beatles and Syd Barrett and the Kinks and many, many more influences, all wrapped up in this really crisp, punchy production by Stephen Street. You can hear that the band is just bursting with ideas. And they're all good. It's the sound of a young band absolutely on the crest of the wave of a movement. And driving that movement as well, before all the pressure and the press and the cynicism starts creeping in, and the backlash and all of that sort of stuff. It's a long album, but I think it sustains that quality. Parklife, Bad Head, Tracy Jacks, End of Century, This Is a Low, To the End. I could recite you the whole album, and I love it all. The album was originally going to be called London, because Noel Gallagher, in the way he does, he said that the Blur was the sound of the Parklife was the sound of Southern England personified. And I think maybe that is one of the reasons why I love it so much, because I'm a Londoner and have been most of my life. This was by far and away their best-selling studio album, selling over 1 million copies, and it debuted at number 1, stayed in the charts for 90 weeks, and Pitchfork magazine put it at number 2 on their list of 50 best Britpop albums of all time. It's a joy listening to this album. I love it, and I go back to it quite frequently. It reminds me of my beer drinking studenty days. So what of Blur away from their studio albums? Well, they've made a number of live albums, some straight to digital. Some are more ragged than others. I don't think their forte really was as a live band. They could be quite inconsistent. They could be quite ragged and raw at times. Coxon has made a number of quite punky indie solo albums, some of them very enjoyable. Damon Albarn's had huge success with Gorillaz and The Good, the Bad and the Queen and all sorts of other projects. I think it's fair to say that he has earned his place at the top table of major contemporary British artists. And I think people think of Damon Albarn certainly with a lot of respect now, if not love. And I'm sure he's perfectly happy with that. Anyway, that is my look back to Britpop and Blur. We'll do some more Britpop at some point. Um, my viewers in America, Blur. What do you make of them? Is it a name that's remotely on your radar? Really, I'm sure you know the song too. But the band itself, did they get across the pond with any sort of lasting impact at all? Um, I'm sure you don't have your list in the same order as mine. And if not, let's see yours and tell me what you think of. Oh, why does that keep happening? And if not, tell me what your order would be. But look, Blur. Until then, Blur. I didn't mean that. Until then, I will see you again very soon for another Rock Records review. Thank you. Bye bye.